He is the most feared man on the East Coast. Politicians tremble at his name, rivals vanish before he finishes his coffee, and entire criminal networks restructure themselves just to avoid crossing him. But at 4 a.m., inside his own bedroom, Damien Voss hears three words that crack something open inside his chest that no bullet, no blade, and no betrayal ever could. His brand new wife is asleep beside him, and she is begging someone not to hit her. This is the story of what a dangerous man does when he discovers the woman he married has already survived a war he never knew existed. Like this video, comment the city you're watching from, and follow so you never miss where this story goes next. The rain started around midnight and hadn't quit. It came in off the Atlantic in heavy, diagonal sheets, hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Voss estate like it had a personal grievance with the glass. The house sat on a bluff above the ocean. 3 stories of dark stone and steel, 12,000 square feet of rooms most people never entered, and a silence so thick at night that you could hear the security cameras rotating on their mounts outside. Damien Voss lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling. He didn't sleep much, never had. His brain was the kind that refused to go quiet, that kept running calculations and contingencies long after the rest of the world shut down. Tonight, it was the Callahan situation. A shipping contract gone sideways in Baltimore, 2 of his lieutenants sending contradictory reports, and a customs official who had stopped returning calls 3 days ago. Problems stacked on problems. The kind of thing that required clean thinking and sharp decisions, neither of which came easy at 3:47 in the morning. He was about to get up, pull on clothes, go down to the study and start making calls to people who would answer, regardless of the hour, when the woman beside him made a sound. It was small, barely audible over the rain. He turned his head. Serafina Hale, Serafina Voss. Now technically, though they had known each other less than a month, lay on her side facing away from him, the white sheets twisted around her legs, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She was trembling. Not the mild kind. The full-body kind. The kind that came from somewhere deep and involuntary, like cold shock or terror. Damien watched her for a moment without moving. She made the sound again. Softer this time, almost like a child. "Please," she whispered. "Please, don't hit me." The words hit him somewhere between the sternum and the throat. He had heard a lot of things in his 41 years. He had heard men beg for their lives in the back rooms of warehouses. He had heard the particular silence that followed a decision being made. He had heard his own father's voice telling him that weakness was a luxury the Voss family could not afford. He had never heard anything that did to him what those 5 words did. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake her. The bedroom was dark except for the faint gray light the storm threw through the windows. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself do since the wedding, since the arrangement was finalized and they had returned to this house as strangers sharing square footage. She was still trembling. Her fingers were curled against the pillow, gripping the fabric like something might tear her away from it. "Hey!" His voice came out rougher than he intended. He reached out and touched her shoulder, barely a graze. "Hey, wake up!" She jolted awake so fast it startled him, sitting upright, one arm flying out defensively, eyes wide and wild and completely unseen for a long, terrible second. Then she focused. Him, the bedroom, the rain. Her arm dropped. She pressed her hand flat against her own sternum like she was checking that her heart was still where she left it. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "Not, are you okay? Not, what time is it? Not, I had a nightmare. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," he said. She was already pulling the sheet up, tucking it around herself like armor. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." He watched her hands move, watched the way she composed herself with practiced efficiency, smoothing her expression, straightening her spine, rebuilding whatever walls she kept assembled around herself even in sleep. It took her about 30 seconds. He had seen professionals debrief after combat with less composure. It disturbed him more than the nightmare had. "Go back to sleep," he said. She nodded without looking at him. Lay back down, pulled the sheet up to her shoulder. He sat there in the dark for another 2 minutes, listening to the rain, listening to her breathing slow and even out. Then he got up, pulled on a shirt, and went down to the study. He did not think about the Callahan situation for the rest of the night. What? Damien had two people he trusted with information that required discretion. The first was Marcus Webb, his head of security, ex-military, methodical, the kind of man who filed incident reports in his sleep. The second was a woman named Claudia Reyes, who had no official title within his organization, but who could find anything about anyone within 48 hours and had never once asked why he needed it. He called Claudia at 5 a.m. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. "I need a background pull," he said. "Full spectrum. Personal history, medical records if you can access them, police reports including sealed ones. Prior marriage." A pause. "Who?" "Serafina Hale, née Hargrove, 34 years old. Prior marriage to a Grant Whitaker, financier. Whitaker Capital, Boston offices." He paused. "Former marriage ended approximately 11 months ago." Another pause, longer this time. "This is your wife?" "Yes." "You want me to pull a full background on your wife?" "I want you to find out what happened to her." Claudia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the professionalism in her voice had a different quality to it. Not less sharp, but more careful. "How fast?" "Fast as you can move." "Give me until noon." She called back at 10:17. Damien was in the study with the door locked, a cup of coffee he hadn't touched going cold on the desk, when his phone buzzed. "Talk," he said. Claudia's voice was flat in the specific way it got when she was reading from notes and keeping her own reaction out of it. "Serafina Hargrove, born Asheville, North Carolina. Scholarship student, University of Virginia, graduated top of her class, education major. Married Grant Whitaker 6 years ago. The marriage is where it gets complicated. Go." First hospital visit 14 months into the marriage. Documented as a fall on stairs. Fractured ulna, right arm. Second visit, 8 months later. Concussion, lacerations above left eye. Documented as a bicycle accident. A pause. "She didn't own a bicycle. I confirmed that." Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Third, fourth, fifth visits over the following 2 years. Various documentation. Sprained wrist, bruised ribs, broken finger. All explained, all accepted. She filed one police report approximately 3 years into the marriage. It was withdrawn within 48 hours. Claudia stopped. "The officer who took the report is currently employed in a consulting capacity by Whitaker Capital's security division." "Of course he is." "There are 2 attempts to contact a women's shelter documented in their intake records from around year 4. Neither resulted in her leaving. Based on the intake notes..." Claudia paused again, and it was the kind of pause that meant she was deciding how to say something. "She indicated she had nowhere to go, that she believed she had caused the incidents, that she was afraid no one would believe her." The room was very quiet. Damien could hear the rain outside, lighter now, tapping against the windows. "The divorce was finalized 11 months ago," Claudia continued. "Grant Whitaker's attorneys managed to ensure she left the marriage with a minimal settlement. She had to sign an NDA regarding the specifics of the marriage's dissolution. She's currently in violation of nothing. The NDA covers her speaking publicly, not any legal proceeding. But practically speaking, it means she hasn't been able to tell anyone the full story." "Who brokered the marriage arrangement between our families?" Damien asked, though he already half knew the answer. "Her uncle, Thomas Hale. He and your attorney made the initial contact. Based on the financial documentation available, Thomas Hale received a consulting fee from Whitaker Capital approximately 3 weeks before he approached your people about the arrangement." Damien set the phone down on the desk very carefully. He sat there for a long moment. Then he picked it up again. "Send me everything, the full file, every document." "Already done. Check your secure server." "Claudia." "Yeah." "Good work." She hung up without responding, which was how she always ended calls. He read the file for 2 hours. He read it with the same methodical attention he brought to intelligence reports on rival organizations, on hostile takeover attempts, on threats to his operations. He read it like it was data. He tried to stay clinical about it because clinical was the only way he knew how to absorb information that required a response. He did not entirely succeed. By the time he closed the last document, the coffee was ice cold and the morning had broken gray and wet outside the windows. Somewhere above him, he could hear footsteps moving across the floor. Serafina, awake, probably moving to the kitchen the way she did every morning, quiet and self-contained, taking up as little space as possible. He thought about the way she'd said, "I'm sorry," when she woke from the nightmare. Not confusion, not disorientation, just immediate, automatic apology. He had thought, when Marcus first briefed him on Serafina Hale as a potential arrangement, that she seemed closed off, guarded. He had attributed it to the circumstances. Arranged marriages were transactional by nature, and wariness was reasonable. He had not pushed. They had been civil, distant. He had respected the distance because distance was something he understood. He understood it differently now. He closed the laptop, went upstairs. She was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of tea, still in the clothes she'd slept in, an oversized sweater, worn at the elbows, that she wore like it was a layer of insulation against something. She was looking out the window at the ocean. She didn't hear him come in. He pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and sat down. She turned at the sound, and for just a half second before her expression settled, before the practiced composure assembled itself across her face, he saw something raw and startled in her eyes. "Good morning," she said. "Sit down," he said. Not a request exactly, but not harsh. She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his face, and then she came to the table and sat across from him, wrapping both hands around her mug. "I want to talk to you," he said, "about last night. I already told you I was sorry. I told you not to apologize for that." He kept his voice level. "I'm not bringing it up to make you feel bad. I'm bringing it up because I want to understand." She looked at her mug. "There's nothing to understand. I had a nightmare. It happens." What was the nightmare about? The pause was fractional, almost invisible, but he caught it. "I don't remember," she said. He looked at her. She didn't look back at him. "I know about Grant Whitaker," he said. The mug stopped moving. He watched her hands tighten around the ceramic, watched her shoulders do something subtle. Not quite a flinch, more like the whole body preparing for impact. "What do you know?" Her voice was careful. "Enough." He paused. "I know about the hospital visits. I know about the police report that disappeared. I know about the shelter contacts." He let that sit for a moment. "I know he hurt you, and I know you spent years trying to get out and couldn't, and I know you signed something that made it difficult to talk about afterward." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to talk about it," he said. "Not right now. Not if you don't want to. But I want you to know that I know, and that it changes nothing about this arrangement except—" He stopped, reconsidered the word arrangement, continued anyway. "Except that you should know you're safe here. That's not a line. It's a fact." Serafina's jaw moved. She pressed her lips together. "You had me investigated," she said. Not angry, almost neutral. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you were crying in your sleep and asking someone not to hit you, and I needed to know who had done that to you." Something in her face shifted, just slightly, like something bracing for a blow that didn't come. "And now you know," she said quietly. "And now I know." She looked at him for the first time since he sat down. Really looked, directly, measuring, the way she rarely did. He held her gaze and kept his face still and let her look, because she had clearly spent a long time in a situation where looking directly at someone got her hurt. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Not right now. I just wanted you to know." She looked back at her mug. Her thumb moved in a slow circle against the ceramic. "He was very convincing," she said finally. Her voice had gone quieter, more internal, like she was talking partly to herself. "In the beginning, for the first year, I thought I was lucky. I thought he loved me. By the time I understood what was actually happening, I had already made myself small enough that I couldn't remember how to be bigger." Damien said nothing. He let her talk. "The worst part isn't what he did." She looked up again, and there was something almost fierce in her expression now. "The worst part is how long I spent believing I deserved it, that if I just did things better, said things differently, was less of whatever he needed me to be less of." She stopped, looked down again. "That's the part that's hardest to scrub out." "You didn't deserve it," Damien said. "I know that now." Her voice was flat, not cold, just worn. "Intellectually, I know it. The rest of me is still catching up." He nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, rain tapping at the windows. the ocean gray and choppy in the distance. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me. Instead of—" She gestured vaguely. He understood what she meant. Instead of using it, instead of holding it as leverage, instead of doing what someone else might have done with that kind of information. "Don't thank me for that," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Damien called Marcus Webb that afternoon. Marcus was a big man, former Army Ranger, who wore his experience in the particular economy with which he moved, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. He had been with Damien for 11 years and had a face that gave nothing away under any circumstances. They met in the security office on the ground floor, a room of monitors and equipment and controlled temperature. "I need you to put something together for me," Damien said. "Personal matter." Marcus waited. "Grant Whitaker, Whitaker Capital, Boston, but he travels. I want to know his current location, his patterns, who he meets with, who he owes." Damien paused. "And I want to know if he has any assets or relationships in this city." Marcus's expression didn't change. "Timeline?" "Yesterday." "Understood." Marcus turned back to his monitor. "Anything specific I'm looking for?" "Whether he's been in contact with Serafina since the divorce." A brief pause. "Has he?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm asking you to find out." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll have something for you by tomorrow morning." Damien turned to leave. "Damien." Marcus used his name instead of his title, which was something he only did when the conversation required it. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough." Marcus said nothing else. The days that followed were strange. The estate didn't change. Same rooms, same staff, same operational rhythm that kept the household running, independent of anything either of its inhabitants chose to do. But something in the internal climate of the place shifted, the way atmospheric pressure shifts before weather. Damien started doing something he hadn't done since the arrangement began. He paid attention. Not surveillance, not monitoring, just presence. He started eating breakfast at the kitchen table instead of standing over his desk with a phone in his hand. He noticed that Serafina woke early and moved through the house quietly, like someone accustomed to minimizing the evidence of their own existence. He noticed that she read constantly, actual books, paper ones, which she left in different rooms around the house like breadcrumbs. He noticed that she had, at some point in the last week, started a small garden project in the enclosed courtyard off the east wing, moving pots around with a kind of focused attention that suggested she was thinking while she worked. He didn't interfere with any of it. He just noticed. She noticed that he noticed. He could tell by the way her posture changed incrementally, the defensive curl of her shoulders relaxing, fractionally, over the course of several days. The way she stopped flinching at sudden sounds, as reflexively as she had in the first weeks. The way, on the fourth morning, she poured him coffee without being asked and slid it across the table without a word, and then went back to her book like it hadn't happened. He drank the coffee and said nothing about it. On the fifth night, he found her in the study at 11 p.m., sitting cross-legged on the couch with a book open in her lap and the reading lamp casting a warm circle of light around her. She looked up when he walked in. "Sorry," she said, then caught herself. "I didn't think you'd need this room tonight." "I don't." He moved to the chair by the window, pulled out his phone, scrolled through messages. "Stay." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at her book. They sat in the same room in silence for an hour and a half, and it was the most comfortable Damien had felt in his own house in longer than he wanted to calculate. Marcus delivered his report on a Tuesday morning. Damien read it standing at the window of the security office, morning light coming through cold and white. Grant Whitaker had not been idle since the divorce. The man had lost ground, publicly, professionally, in the specific ways that happened when a wealthy man's veneer began to crack at the edges without anyone being entirely sure why. 2 clients had withdrawn from Whitaker Capital in the past 8 months. A board seat he'd held for 6 years had been quietly not renewed. The gossip in financial circles was vague but persistent, that Whitaker was unreliable, that his judgment had slipped, that there was something underneath the polished surface that people couldn't quite name but had started to feel. He had also, according to Marcus's research, been drinking more, spending more, moving through his Boston penthouse with increasing irregularity sometimes not returning for days. Most significantly, 3 weeks ago, Grant Whitaker had hired a private investigator. The PI had been tasked, as best as Marcus could determine, with locating Serafina. "He knows where she is?" Damien asked. "Not yet. But he knows she's married again." Marcus tapped the folder. "He seems to be taking that personally." Damien set the folder on the desk. He looked at the wall of monitors without seeing them. "Close the perimeter," he said. "Anyone coming on this property gets flagged. I don't care who they are or what reason they give." "Already done." "I want eyes on Whitaker, not contact, just eyes." "I'll have a team in Boston by tonight." Damien nodded, picked up the folder, put it down again. "Does she need to know?" Marcus considered this with the honest weight it deserved. "If he gets closer, yes. Right now." He let the pause sit. "She's starting to sleep through the night. That's what Elaine tells me." Elaine was the housekeeper, who had quietly become something like a proxy family member to Serafina over the past weeks without anyone formally acknowledging it had happened. "Might be worth giving her a little more time before you put that threat back in her line of sight." Damien said nothing for a long moment. "Keep monitoring," he said finally. "Tell me the second anything changes." What changed Damien's understanding of his own situation happened on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon. He had come home earlier than expected. A meeting canceled, the afternoon suddenly open, which happened so rarely that he wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. He found the house quiet, walked through to the east courtyard on instinct. Serafina was there, kneeling in the dirt beside one of the stone planters, hands black with soil, hair escaping its tie on one side. She was talking to herself, not quite talking, more like murmuring under her breath, the way people do when they're thinking through something and the thoughts have gotten too numerous to keep entirely internal. She didn't hear him approach. He stopped at the courtyard entrance and watched her work. She was planting roses. He hadn't realized the pots she'd been moving and rearranging all week were for roses, which she was now transferring from their nursery containers into the stone planters with a careful, deliberate attention to root placement that suggested she knew what she was doing and took it seriously. She looked. He found himself searching for the right word and landing on it, despite the fact that it was not the kind of word he generally used: free. The composure she wore like armor in every conversation was entirely gone. She was just a woman in the dirt, coaxing something alive into the ground, completely unperformed. He stepped back before she could see him, walked back inside, went to the study, sat down in the chair and looked at the wall for a while. He had married her because the arrangement made strategic sense, because the Hale family connection resolved a particular complication in his Boston operations, because his attorney had laid out the logic in a 2-page memo and the logic had been sound. He had not married her expecting to feel anything beyond a professional obligation to be civil. He was no longer certain what he was feeling, but he was certain it was no longer nothing. Todsem. The call from Boston came at 2 a.m. on a Friday. Damien's phone buzzed him out of a rare deep sleep, Marcus's name on the screen. He was upright and answering before he was fully conscious. "Talk," he said. Whitaker's PI made contact with someone on the estate staff. Marcus's voice was controlled. "Kitchen supplier. He's been feeding information. We don't believe he knows her specific location within the property, but he confirmed she's here, confirmed she's living as your wife." Damien stood, moved to the window. "When?" "The contact happened this afternoon. We flagged it an hour ago when we pulled the supplier's communications." "Is Whitaker moving?" A pause that lasted a half-second too long. "He flew out of Boston tonight," Marcus said. "Private charter. Destination unclear. Could be New York. Could be here." Damien looked out at the ocean. Black water. No horizon. "Wake the full security team," he said. "Lock down the property. And Marcus..." "Yeah. Don't let him near her." He ended the call and stood in the dark for a moment. Then he turned toward the hallway. He needed to tell her. He walked to her door. They kept separate rooms, had from the beginning, which had seemed appropriate at the time, and raised his hand to knock, and stopped. Through the door he could hear her breathing, slow, even, untroubled. For the first time in weeks she was sleeping without making a sound. He lowered his hand, stood in the hallway for a long moment, the estate locked down around him, his people moving into position outside, the Atlantic crashing somewhere below in the dark. Then he went back to his room, sat in the chair by the window, and watched the driveway until morning. He did not sleep again. And just before dawn, when the security camera feed on his laptop showed a black sedan slowing at the base of the estate road, engine idling, not moving, sitting there like a question that hadn't been asked yet, Damien felt something cold and absolute settle into his chest. Grant Whitaker had found her. And Damien Voss was going to have to make a decision about what happened next that no business arrangement had ever prepared him for. The sedan didn't move. It sat at the base of the estate road for 11 minutes. Damien timed it on the laptop feed, watching the timestamp tick in the corner of the screen. Engine running, headlights off, just a dark shape against the darker road. Then it pulled a slow U-turn and disappeared back toward the highway. Damien didn't move from the chair. He sat there until full light came up over the ocean, gray softening to pale gold, and then he closed the laptop and went downstairs and made coffee with his own hands because the kitchen staff didn't arrive until 7 and he needed something to do with them. Marcus called at 6:45. The sedan was a rental, paid cash through a third-party app, which means someone knew what they were doing or paid someone who did. We pulled the plates, reported stolen 2 days ago in Providence. A pause. It wasn't Whitaker driving. He doesn't do his own field work. Then he sent someone to confirm the location. That's my read. Damien poured coffee into a mug and stared at the surface of it. Where is he now? Hotel in the city? The Aldrich. Checked in last night under his own name, which is either arrogant or stupid. With Grant Whitaker, it's usually both. He drank the coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. I want someone in the lobby. Passive. I don't want him spooked. I want to know who he meets with, what he orders from room service, whether he makes any calls from the hotel line. Already on it. And Marcus. He set the mug down. I need you to find out what he wants, not what he's doing, what he actually wants. Because men like him don't just show up. They show up because they think they have leverage. The line was quiet for a moment. You think he knows something, Marcus said. I think he's been building towards something since the divorce, and he finally thinks the timing is right. Damien looked out the kitchen window at the courtyard. The rose planters sat in the early morning light, dark soil tamped down around new stems. Find out what it is. He ended the call. Stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, the estate quiet around him, and made a decision he'd been circling since 2 in the morning. He was going to tell her today. Tuck. She came downstairs at 7:15, same as every morning. The oversized sweater, hair loose, the book from last night tucked under her arm like she planned to finish it over breakfast. She stopped when she saw him at the table, which she did every morning too, that fraction of a second of recalibration before her expression settled into something neutral and functional. You're up early, she said. Didn't sleep. She moved to the counter, started the kettle. He watched her and tried to organize the words he'd been rehearsing since 6 a.m. into something that wouldn't detonate the careful, tentative steadiness they'd built over the past few weeks. There was no version of this that didn't blow a hole in it. Serafina. She turned at the tone. Not afraid, not anymore, or not as immediately, but alert. The way an animal gets alert when something in the environment changes frequency. Sit down, he said. Then, because he knew how that landed, please. She came to the table, sat across from him, didn't touch the mug she'd brought with her, just looked at him and waited with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that waiting was sometimes the only safe response. Grant is in the city, he said. The stillness became something else, something harder and more absolute, like water flash freezing. He checked into a hotel last night, Damien continued. He's been looking for you for several weeks, hired someone to track you. Someone on the property staff was feeding information to his PI. We've handled that. He kept his voice even, factual, because that was what she needed right now, not comfort, not softening, just the truth in plain language, delivered straight. Last night a vehicle came to the base of the road, just surveillance. Nobody got close to the house. Serafina's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at a point somewhere between them, rather than at him. How long have you known he hired someone? She asked. Since yesterday. And the staff member? Fired this morning. He won't talk about this property or anything in it. She nodded slowly. The nod was mechanical. The rest of her was somewhere else entirely, somewhere he didn't have access to. Hey. He said it more quietly. Look at me. She looked up. He is not getting near you, Damien said. I need you to hear that as a fact, not a reassurance. He is not getting close to this house, to you, to anything in your life. That is not a promise I'm making to make you feel better. That is the current operational reality. She held his gaze for a long moment. You can't control what he does, she said. Not a challenge, just a statement of something she believed in her bones from long experience. No, he said, but I can control what happens to him when he does it. Something moved across her face that he couldn't fully read. Not reassurance exactly, more like the expression of someone doing very rapid internal calculations. What does he want? She asked. I don't know yet. He wants me to come back. Her voice was flat. That's what he always wants. When he lost control of something, he wanted it returned to him. He doesn't think of it as wanting a person. He thinks of it as wanting his property back. She looked down at the table again. He'll have convinced himself I was taken from him. She gestured at the space between them. He'll have built a story where he's the injured party. Damien said nothing. He recognized the shape of what she was describing because he had encountered men like that before. The ones who rewrote the truth so thoroughly, they became unable to locate the original. He's dangerous when he thinks he's been wronged, she said. I know. No! She looked up again, and something in her eyes was very direct, very serious. You know he hurt me. That's different. What I'm telling you is that he is specifically dangerous when he feels like a victim. He stops calculating. He stops caring about consequences. A pause. The times he hurt me the worst were the times he'd convinced himself I'd done something to provoke it. The kitchen was very quiet. Understood, Damien said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her mug, found it empty, and went to make tea. He watched her move to the counter and fill the kettle and do the small, ordinary things that steadied her, and he understood that she was not falling apart and was not going to fall apart, and that this steadiness was not the absence of fear, but something she had built on top of it through years of having no other option. He respected it. He also hated that she'd had to build it. That. The call came at noon, not from Marcus, from a number Damien didn't recognize, which meant it had been routed through a clean line, which meant whoever was calling had resources and knew how to use them. He stepped out of the study onto the stone terrace overlooking the ocean and answered. Mr. Voss? The voice was smooth, clipped, Bostonian without being theatrical about it. I think we should talk. You have 30 seconds to tell me who you are before I hang up and trace this line back to whatever rock you're calling from. A pause. My name is Grant Whitaker. Damien said nothing. I believe we have something to discuss, Whitaker continued. The smoothness in his voice had a quality that Damien recognized. It was the kind of smooth that came from years of performing confidence for boardrooms and dining rooms and people who needed to believe in you. Under it, if you listened past the surface, there was something pulled tight. Specifically regarding my former wife, who I believe is currently living in your home. Your former wife, Damien said. Former, that's the operative word. The divorce was coerced, Whitaker said. Calm, certain. She was not in a condition to make rational decisions at the time. The agreement she signed was obtained under duress. Is that right? She needs help, Mr. Voss. I don't know what she's told you about our marriage, but I can assure you that Serafina has a history of... Stop! The word came out of Damien flat and cold, and with enough weight that it actually interrupted the man, which Whitaker clearly hadn't expected. I know what happened in your marriage. I know specifically and in detail, and what I know is not what you're about to tell me. Silence on the line. So let me be very clear, Damien said. You're going to check out of the Aldrich. You are going to get on the first available flight back to Boston. You are going to discontinue whatever arrangement you have with your private investigator, and you are never, under any circumstances, going to attempt to contact Serafina again. He paused. These are not negotiating positions. When Whitaker spoke again, the smoothness had thinned. Just slightly, just enough. You don't understand what you're involved in. I understand exactly what I'm involved in. She's not who you think she is. A new quality in the voice now, something that wanted to sound like concern and wasn't. She manipulates. She has a pattern of I told you to stop. Damien watched a fishing vessel move across the gray horizon, slow, deliberate, indifferent to everything on shore. You're describing yourself. I've seen men do that before. Take the thing they are and assign it to the person they hurt. It's a very old trick, and it doesn't work on me. The silence this time was different, longer. Damien could hear the other man breathing. I want to meet, Whitaker said finally. In person. Neutral location. Why? Because I have information about your organization that you would prefer remained private, and I think a conversation face-to-face would be more productive than— There it is, Damien said quietly. Excuse me? The leverage. That's what I was waiting for. He almost felt something like relief, not because the threat was welcome, but because knowing the shape of a problem made it manageable. You've been sitting in that hotel building yourself up to this call, and you needed something to stand on, so you went looking for something to use. I'm simply suggesting you're threatening me. Damien's voice stayed level. Be honest with yourself about what you're doing, even if you can't be honest with me. You are threatening a man whose particular expertise you do not fully understand, using information you have not verified, because you are desperate and you think desperation can be made to look like power if you dress it up right. He paused. It can't. Another silence. Meet with me, Whitaker said. The smoothness was mostly gone now. What was underneath it was harder to categorize. Not quite fear, not quite fury. Something unstable, oscillating between them. One conversation, that's all I'm asking. Damien thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Fine, he said. I'll send you an address. Come alone. He ended the call. Went back inside. Found Marcus already moving toward him from the hallway, which meant Marcus had been monitoring the call. The waterfront warehouse on Deller Street, Damien said. Tonight at 9. Make sure it's clean and make sure we have people positioned before he arrives. Marcus nodded, started to turn. And Marcus, he stopped. I want this handled carefully. No escalation unless he forces it. Understood. A pause. Are you going to tell her about the meeting? Damien thought about Serafina in the kitchen that morning. The flat, certain knowledge in her voice. He becomes dangerous when he feels like a victim. Not yet, he said. The warehouse on Deller Street had been Damien's for 6 years. He used it occasionally for the kind of conversations that required a location without witnesses or ambient noise, which was a specific category of conversation that his life produced with uncomfortable regularity. The building smelled like salt water and old machinery, and the particular cold that accumulated in spaces where no one lived. A single industrial light hung from the center beam. Everything outside its circle was dark. Damien arrived at 8:40. Marcus and 2 others were already positioned, inside, invisible, the way they'd done this before. Whitaker arrived at 9:04. He came alone, which was either compliance or stupidity. He was thinner than the photographs in his file suggested, and his suit was expensive but worn with the particular carelessness of someone who had stopped caring about details. He stepped into the pool of light under the hanging fixture and looked around and then looked at Damien and tried to reassemble the smooth public face. It didn't quite fit anymore. Thank you for coming, he said. You said you had information, Damien said. Let's hear it. Whitaker looked around the warehouse again. This is a bit theatrical. I like controlled environments. Damien stayed where he was, 10 feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. The information. Whitaker straightened, pulled something out internally that was supposed to be composure. I've had your organization looked into. Your Baltimore operation specifically. I have documentation that could be very uncomfortable for you if it reached the wrong people. And by wrong people, you mean? Federal level. Damien looked at him. Do you have it with you? I'm not an idiot. Then we're having a theoretical conversation, which means you have nothing except the idea of something. He tilted his head slightly. Is that really what you flew down here for? The composure cracked. Just a line, hairline thin, but visible. I want to see her. That's not happening. She's my wife. She is not your wife. Damien's voice dropped in temperature rather than volume. She was your wife. She is not anymore. She signed papers. Those papers are real regardless of whatever you've decided to believe about them. She was manipulated into By whom? By her attorney? By her own will to survive? He let that land. Or by you for 6 years until she finally got out? Whitaker's face did something complicated and not entirely controlled. You don't know what went on in that marriage. I know what the hospital documented. I know what the shelter intake forms say. I know what the police report said before it disappeared. A pause. I know what your security consultant did to make it disappear. The silence in the warehouse was total. Whitaker's jaw worked. Those were accidents. Say that again, Damien said quietly. She wasn't stable. She would hurt herself and then... Stop. The word hit like something physical. I'm going to tell you this once, clearly, so there is no confusion about where we stand. He took 2 steps forward, closing the distance to something that made the geography of the conversation different. You are going to leave this city. You are going to return to Boston. You are going to shut down your investigation, terminate your PI, and delete every piece of information you have collected about her location and her life. And then you are going to spend whatever remains of your time and energy constructing a future for yourself that has nothing to do with Serafina. Whitaker didn't step back. He wanted to. Damien could see it in his body, but he held his ground, which was either courage or the refusal to accept what was happening. And if I don't, he said, then the documentation I have about your marriage becomes very public. Not to federal investigators. I have no interest in that kind of process. Public. The kind that ends careers, freezes assets, and makes it impossible to eat lunch in Boston without someone knowing exactly what you did to your wife for 6 years. He held Whitaker's eyes. The kind that follows you. Whitaker's face had gone pale under the industrial light. You can't. I already have. Damien stepped back, returned his hands to his pockets. Whatever leverage you thought you were bringing into this building tonight, it doesn't exist. I'm not afraid of your documentation because mine is better. I'm not afraid of your connections because mine reach further. And I am very specifically not afraid of you. He turned slightly, a dismissal without being quite one. We're done here. Go back to your hotel. Get on a plane in the morning. Whitaker stood under the light for a long moment. His breathing was audible. Something was happening behind his eyes. A calculation collapsing, maybe, or a different one starting to form. Then he said, very quietly, she came back to me twice, you know, after she left. She kept coming back. Damien stopped. She'd leave and she'd be gone for a week, 2 weeks, and then she'd come back. Because whatever she told herself about who I was, she couldn't... He stopped, swallowed. She always came back. Damien turned back to face him. I know, he said. I know she did. And I know what that cost her, and I know what it took for her to stop. He looked at Whitaker with something that wasn't quite contempt. Something more like the recognition you felt for a dangerous thing that had finally been accurately identified. She's not coming back this time. He walked toward the exit. Behind him, Whitaker's voice. This isn't over. Damien didn't turn around. It is, he said. You just don't know it yet. Go. He drove home along the coast road, the Atlantic black on his left, the city lights scattered on his right, Marcus riding silent in the passenger seat. Halfway home, Marcus said, He's not going to leave. No, Damien agreed. He's going to push again. Yes. Marcus looked out the window. Then what? Damien drove. The headlights cut 60 feet of road ahead of them, and the rest was dark. Then we handle it, he said. He said it with the same tone he used for every operational problem. Clean, decisive. Because that was how you held the line. You said the words with enough certainty that the uncertainty underneath them couldn't find any air. But when he pulled through the estate gate and saw the lights on in the courtyard, Serafina, still out there at 10 in the evening, kneeling beside the rose planters in the wash of the exterior light, moving soil around some new cutting she'd gotten from somewhere. Something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with operational clarity. He cut the engine, sat in the car for a moment. She hadn't seen him yet. She was working with her back to the driveway, absorbed, unhurried, the way she got out there when the garden became the only thing in her field of attention. He thought about Whitaker's voice. She always came back. He thought about what it had taken each time for a woman who'd been made to believe she deserved it to walk out that door and try to build a version of herself outside of it, and then what it had taken each time for the same woman to be pulled back, and what it had finally taken for her to stop being pulled. He got out of the car. She heard the door and turned, and he could see the quick assessment she always did, reading the situation before committing to a response. And then she relaxed when it was him, which still moved something in him, that she relaxed when it was him specifically. "Late," she said. "Yeah." He came to stand at the courtyard entrance. "You should be inside. It's cold." "I'm fine." She turned back to the planter. "I'm just finishing this one." He watched her work for a moment. "Serafina." She looked up at that. "I met with Grant tonight," he said. She went very still. Her hand stopped moving in the soil. "I told him to leave," Damien said. "I was clear about the consequences if he didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. And he's not going to leave." He said it straight because she deserved that. "He's going to push again. I don't know when or how, but he's not the kind of man who accepts." "I know what kind of man he is." Her voice was quiet, not frightened. Something past frightened. Something that had been frightened so many times it had metabolized into a different substance. "I know exactly what kind of man he is." "I know you do." She looked down at the dark soil. Her hands were still in it, palms down, like she was steadying herself through the ground. "He told you I came back," she said. Not a question. Damien said nothing. "He would have told you that." Her jaw was tight. He always framed it that way, like it was evidence of something, like it proved. She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I came back because I had no money and no job and no family he hadn't already poisoned against me, and because he had spent 6 years making sure that was true. That's why I came back." She looked up, and her eyes were dry and very clear. "Not because I loved him, not because I wanted to be there, because he made sure there was nowhere else." "I know," Damien said. "I know that's why." She held his gaze, searching for something in it, disbelief, judgment, the particular calculation of a man deciding what someone else's past meant for his own plans. She didn't find any of it. What she found instead, Damien couldn't name from the outside. But he watched something in her face change. Not break, not collapse, but shift. Like a door opening a crack that had been sealed shut. "I'm tired," she said finally. "Go inside," he said. "Get some sleep." She stood, brushed the soil from her hands, and walked past him toward the house. At the doorway, she stopped. "Damien." He looked at her. "Whatever he said to you tonight," she said, "whatever version of me he gave you, it didn't land," he said. She looked at him for one more second, then she went inside. He stood in the cold courtyard for a while, looking at the rose cuttings in the dark, at the careful, patient work she'd put into the soil. His phone buzzed. "Marcus." He answered. "Whitaker just made a call from his hotel room," Marcus said. "Burner line we haven't been able to trace yet. Talked for 4 minutes." A pause. "And Damien, he'd checked out of the Aldrich." Damien's jaw tightened. "Where did he go?" "We don't know yet. He went out the back of the hotel. We lost him in the parking structure." Another pause, the kind that came before information that changed the shape of a situation. "But before he left, he made one more call. This one we did trace." "To whom?" "Thomas Hale," Marcus said. "Her uncle." The cold of the courtyard settled into Damien's chest like a stone dropping into still water. Thomas Hale. Her uncle. The man who had brokered the arrangement. The man who had collected a consulting fee from Whitaker Capital 3 weeks before approaching Damien's attorney with the marriage proposal. He stood very still with the phone pressed against his ear, and the pieces rearranged themselves in his mind with the particular nausea of a pattern becoming visible too late. "How long ago was the call?" he said. 17 minutes? Duration? 8 minutes, 40 seconds. Long enough to give someone instructions, long enough to make a plan. "Find Whitaker," Damien said. "Every resource we have. And pull everything on Thomas Hale. His financials, his current location, every communication in the last 30 days. Already moving on Whitaker. Hale..." Marcus paused. "Damien, if Hale is involved in this, that changes the shape of the arrangement significantly." "I know what it changes." "It means the marriage itself may have been..." "I know what it means." His voice came out harder than he intended. He softened it by a fraction. Just get me the information. He ended the call. Stood in the courtyard alone with the roses and the cold and the sound of the ocean below the bluff, doing the thing he did when a situation required it, stripping the emotion out and looking at the structure underneath. The structure underneath was not good. Thomas Hale had accepted money from Grant Whitaker. Then Thomas Hale had approached Damien's organization with a marriage proposal for his niece. That sequence meant one of two things. Either the arrangement had been engineered by Whitaker to place Serafina back under a form of control she couldn't easily escape. Married to a man of Damien's particular profile, she would be contained, her credibility destroyed if she tried to speak about what Whitaker had done, or it meant something more complex and worse, involving Damien's operations in ways he couldn't yet see. Either way, someone had used Serafina as a piece on a board she didn't know she was sitting on. He went inside. He did not sleep. He sat in the study with the financial files Marcus had already compiled on Thomas Hale open on his laptop, reading with the focused attention of a man dismantling a mechanism in order to understand how it was designed to detonate. Thomas Hale was 61 years old. Import consulting, legitimate on the surface, with a secondary layer of arrangements that weren't. He had a long and quiet relationship with several of Damien's peripheral competitors. Not enemies, exactly, but interests that ran adjacent and occasionally contrary to the Voss organization. He had introduced Serafina to Grant Whitaker 7 years ago. He had introduced her to Whitaker. Damien sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Not just brokered the marriage arrangement, introduced them in the first place, which meant Thomas Hale had been managing Serafina as a social and financial asset for at minimum 7 years, and which meant that every relationship she thought she had with her own family had been running through a man who treated her as leverage. He thought about what she'd said in the kitchen. He made sure there was nowhere else. She hadn't known that the nowhere else had been constructed deliberately, that the isolation wasn't just the organic cruelty of one bad man, but something more architectural, built with her uncle's hands, using her uncle's knowledge of exactly which walls would hold her in. At 4 in the morning, he closed the laptop and went upstairs. He stood outside her door for a moment. Then he knocked. She answered faster than someone should who had been asleep, which meant she hadn't been. She opened the door in the oversized sweater and looked at him with eyes that were tired and alert in equal measure. And she read his face the way she always did, that rapid assessment. Whatever she saw in it made her step back from the door. He came in. The room was dim, one lamp on beside the bed, a book face down on the nightstand that she clearly hadn't been reading. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. "How well do you know your uncle?" he said. Something moved through her expression. "Thomas?" "Yes." She looked at her hands. "He raised me. After my parents, after the accident, when I was 15. He's the only family I have." A pause. "Why?" "When did you meet Grant Whitaker?" She looked up. "What is that?" "When did you meet him?" "Thomas introduced us." She said it slowly, the words arriving with a weight she was already beginning to feel without knowing why. "At a fundraiser. I was 27. Thomas said he thought we'd get along, that Grant was... He said Grant was a good man with a solid reputation and that he cared about me finding someone stable." Her voice had gone quieter with each word, the sentence losing confidence as it moved toward its end. "Serafina." He kept his voice level. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without making a decision about what it means until I've finished." She looked at him. Her hands were very still in her lap. Thomas Hale received a payment from Whitaker Capital approximately 3 weeks before he came to my organization with the proposal for our arrangement. He watched her face. "I don't know yet what the full nature of his relationship with Grant is. What I know is that the payment exists and that the sequence of events, him bringing you to Grant, then years later bringing you to me, suggests that your uncle has been managing your life in ways you weren't aware of." The room was completely silent. She didn't move for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of everything except the core of it. "How long have you known about the payment?" "Since early this morning." "And you met with Grant tonight anyway?" "Yes." "Without telling me about Thomas?" "I didn't have the full picture yet." She stood up, not violently, just a movement that needed more space than sitting aloud. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the dark. "He picked Grant," she said. The words came out with a terrible flatness. "He told me Grant was a good man. He vouched for him. When things started getting bad, when I tried to tell him..." She stopped, pressed her hand against the glass. "He told me I was being dramatic. He told me Grant was under stress, and that marriage required patience, and that I needed to be more..." She stopped again. Damien said nothing. He knew. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He had to have known. Because I told him. I told him specifically, and he... She turned. Her eyes were dry, and her face was something past crying, something that came after crying had been burned through enough times that it no longer arrived automatically. "He told me to go home." "I know," Damien said. "Do you?" Not sarcastic. Genuinely asking, Cha, do you understand what that is? What it means to try to say the thing you've been terrified to say and have the only person you trusted look at you and tell you to go home. "He was the only person I..." She stopped, sat back down on the edge of the bed, put her face in her hands. Not crying, just holding the weight of it with her hands. Damien got up from the chair. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, not close enough to crowd her, just close enough that she could feel someone was there. "Grant called him tonight," Damien said. "After our meeting, I don't know what was said." She lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were red but dry. "He's going to help Grant. Whatever Grant is planning, Thomas is going to help him." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had learned to trust their worst predictions. "He always took Grant's side." "Then we deal with both of them," Damien said. She looked at him. "You're not alone in this," he said. "That's not a reassurance. That's the current operational reality." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something was happening in her face. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more fundamental than either. Like a calculation reaching a new conclusion. "Okay," she said quietly. He nodded. Started to rise. Her hand caught his wrist. Barely. Fingertips, not a grip. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For telling me, even though it's..." She didn't finish the sentence. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll know more by morning." She let go of his wrist. He went back to the study and didn't sleep at all. Marcus had Whitaker's location by 6 a.m. He was in a rental property 20 minutes from the estate, a house in the coastal developments north of the city, the kind of short-term furnished property that could be booked under a corporate name and leave no obvious trail. He had apparently moved there directly from the Aldrich. He had not been alone when he arrived. "Thomas Hale flew in last night," Marcus said. 10:45 p.m. He's at the same property. Damien was standing at the kitchen counter with coffee he wasn't drinking, wearing yesterday's clothes. He processed this with the part of his mind that processed threats before the rest of him caught up. "They were coordinating before Whitaker made the call," he said. "Has to be. The flight would have been booked before the call, given the timing. Then the call was confirmation, not planning." He set the mug down. "What's in the house?" "Two of Whitaker's people we've identified from his Boston operation. Personal security. Not sophisticated. More muscle than anything tactical." A pause. "And Damien. They had a visitor this morning at 5:30 a.m. "Who?" "We're still working on the ID male 50s arrived in a city vehicle." Marcus's voice was careful. "Could be nothing. Could be someone Whitaker has on the local level. A city vehicle." Damien thought about the police report that had disappeared from Serafina's file. The officer now employed by Whitaker Capital's security division. The particular way that men like Grant Whitaker accumulated small, dirty loyalties in the places where they were most useful. "Keep working on the ID," he said, "and I want to know the minute anyone leaves that house." He ended the call, turned around. Serafina was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had been there long enough to have heard at least part of it. He could tell by her face the particular stillness that meant information was being absorbed and sorted at speed. "Thomas is here," she said. "Yes." She walked to the counter and poured herself coffee without asking, stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the courtyard through the window. The roses were there, catching the early light. "What are they planning?" she said. "I don't know yet." She turned. "Best guess." He looked at her. She held the gaze steadily, and he understood that she was asking not because she couldn't handle the answer, but because she needed to be in the room where the thinking happened. She was done being managed, done being protected by omission. Whitaker wants access to you, he said. Whether that means trying to take you physically, or trying to legally complicate our arrangement, or trying to damage me enough that my protection becomes unreliable. I don't know which approach he's settled on. Thomas gives him local knowledge and family access. The man from the city this morning potentially gives him legal or enforcement cover. He paused. Any one of those I can handle. All three together requires more precision. She nodded slowly, drank her coffee. There's something else, she said. Isn't there? He looked at her. You have a face you make when there's something else, she said. You get very still and you look at something that isn't in the room. He almost said no. He caught it before it came out. The arrangement, he said. The marriage. If Thomas engineered it, if there's documentation that he received payment before proposing it, it could be argued that the arrangement itself was structured under false premises, which is something Whitaker could use in a legal context to have it voided. He kept his voice even. That would leave you without the legal protection of this household. She was quiet for a moment. And you? What does it leave you? Exposed in some context, depending on what else Thomas has given them. He paused. But that's manageable. Stop managing it, she said sharply. He looked at her. Stop calculating what to tell me and tell me the whole thing, because I spent 6 years with a man who decided what I could handle, and he was always wrong and I can't... She stopped, set her mug down. Tell me the whole thing. If the arrangement is voided and Thomas has given Whitaker enough information about my Baltimore operations, Whitaker has enough to walk into a federal building and trade information for protection from anything I might do to him. He said it clean. He probably doesn't understand fully what he has or how to use it properly, but he has enough to cause serious damage. And with a city contact providing cover, he could move against you directly before I could respond. The kitchen was silent. So he's not just trying to get me back, she said. No. He's trying to destroy you in the process. Trying to make me radioactive enough that you have no reason to stay and no protection if you do. He looked at her. That's my read. She absorbed this. He watched her do it. The rapid internal processing, the way she stood straighter as the weight of it settled rather than collapsing under it. Okay, she said again. Same word she'd used last night. Same particular quality. Not surrender, not bravado. Just acknowledgement that the situation was what it was and something had to be done about it. His phone went off. Marcus, calling instead of texting, which meant it was urgent. He answered immediately. What? They moved. Marcus's voice was taut. Whitaker and Thomas both left the house 20 minutes ago. We had a delay on the tracking, saw someone swept the rental car, found the device we'd placed. A pause. We picked them up again on city cameras heading toward the estate road. Damien turned toward the window. ETA? He said. 7 minutes. Maybe less, depending on traffic. He looked at Serafina. She had heard. Her face was composed in the specific way of someone doing rapid threat assessment. Lock down the gate, he said to Marcus. Full team visible at the perimeter. I don't want them getting within 100 yards of the house. He paused. And Marcus? Who's with them? How many vehicles? A silence that lasted too long. 3 vehicles, Marcus said. And Damien? The third one. It's a police unit. The words landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Serafina's face changed. Not fear. Something worse than fear. Recognition. He brought a cop, she said. Yes. Then he's not coming to threaten you. Her voice was very quiet. He's coming to take me. The gate camera feed appeared on Damien's phone. Marcus had pushed it to him automatically. 3 vehicles on the estate road, moving at the unhurried pace of people who believed they had the authority to move at any pace they chose. The police unit at the rear, light bar dark, official enough. Damien's mind moved through the available responses in the time it took him to draw one breath. A confrontation at the gate with a police unit present changed the parameters entirely. He could lock it down. He had grounds, private property, and his legal team could make the argument. But the optics of a Voss estate turning away a police unit with a family member of the resident present would create a narrative that Whitaker could use. It would look like exactly what Whitaker needed it to look like. And if Thomas Hale, as Serafina's only living family, made a formal request for welfare check on his niece, that police unit could push the issue in ways that would take hours to legally untangle. Hours Whitaker would use. He looked at Serafina. She looked back at him. In her eyes there was fear. Real, physical, the kind that lived in the body below the level of decision-making. But there was also something else. Something that had been building over weeks of sleeping through the night, and planting roses and sitting in the same room with a man who hadn't once looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. He had handled 100 situations more complex than this on paper. But standing in the kitchen with the gate feed on his phone, and 3 minutes before everything became irrevocable, he felt the particular weight of a situation where the wrong move didn't cost him an asset or a contract or a position. It cost her. "Stay inside," he said. "Stay away from the windows." He was already moving toward the entry hall. "Marcus has people at the gate. Nothing comes through that gate without my explicit clearance." "Damien." Her voice stopped him at the doorway. He turned. "He's going to tell the officer I'm being held here," she said, "that I want to leave and you won't let me. That's what Thomas is for. Thomas can say I called him, that I reached out, that I'm not here voluntarily." Her jaw was tight. "That's the play. They don't need to break down the gate. They just need the officer to get me to confirm or deny, and if I deny it with Grant standing right there..." She stopped. He understood. With Whitaker there to perform whatever he had prepared to perform, the concerned former husband, the worried uncle, the collaborative approach that had served him for years, even Serafina's own denial could be framed as something coerced. "Then I need you to do something harder than staying inside," he said. She waited. "I need you to come to the gate with me," he said, "and I need you to say what's true." She stood very still for a moment. 2 minutes on the clock. Maybe less. "I've never been able to do that before," she said. "Every time I tried to say what was true, he was right there to..." "I've never been able to do that before," she said. "Every time I tried to say what was true, he was right there to..." "He's not going to be able to do that this time," Damien said, "because I'm going to be standing next to you." She looked at him for one long second, then she nodded. He moved. She moved with him. The gate was 140 yards from the front door, down a stone-paved drive flanked by low hedgerows that collected the morning mist. Damien walked it fast, Serafina half a step behind him, and by the time they cleared the hedgerow line, he could see the 3 vehicles on the other side of the iron. 2 black SUVs and a white and blue city unit, all idling, all waiting. Marcus was already at the gate with 2 of his people. He clocked Damien's approach and fell back 1 step without being told, which was why Marcus had lasted 11 years. Grant Whitaker was standing outside the first SUV. He was wearing a suit despite the hour, which told Damien everything about how he had spent the night. Not sleeping, performing. Building himself up into the version of himself he needed to be for this. His face had the specific composition of a man who had rehearsed. Controlled surface. Injured underneath, or the performance of injured. The posture of someone who believed they were owed something and had come to collect. Thomas Hale stood beside him. 61 years old, silver-haired, a face that had learned to look trustworthy the way some faces learn to look anything, through long practice and low-stakes testing. He was looking at the gate rather than at Damien, and when his eyes moved to Serafina, they did something complicated and quick that he immediately smoothed over. She saw it. Damien felt her register it beside him. A small tightening of the body, a breath taken and held. The officer was young, late 20s, maybe 30, standing beside the police unit with the particular body language of someone who wasn't entirely sure they belonged in the situation they'd been brought into. He had his thumbs in his belt, and his eyes were moving between the gate and Whitaker and Damien with the look of a man doing rapid reassessment. Good, Damien thought. Uncertain was workable. Certain would have been harder. He stopped at the gate, didn't open it. "Mr. Voss." Whitaker's voice was smooth and morning fresh, rehearsed right up to the surface. "Thank you for coming out." "You're on my property road," Damien said. "State your business." "I'm here because Thomas received a message from Serafina 2 days ago indicating she wanted to leave and didn't feel safe doing so." He said it cleanly, the prepared sentence landing exactly as prepared. "We've come to make sure she's all right and to offer her transportation if she needs it." Damien didn't look at Thomas. He looked at the officer. "What's your name?" The officer straightened slightly. "Officer Reyes." "Officer Reyes, I want you to understand what's happening here." Damien kept his voice level and clear, the tone of a man stating facts rather than arguing them. "This man," he indicated Whitaker, "is my wife's former husband. A restraining order exists in her name against him, filed in Barnstable County, active as of 8 months ago." He watched Reyes's face process this. "Before you act on whatever he's told you, I'd suggest you confirm that order exists." Reyes looked at Whitaker. Whitaker's composure didn't break, but it shifted. A micro-expression, half a second recalibration. "The order is being reviewed," he said. "There are grounds to contest it that being reviewed and voided are different things," Damien said. "While it's active, his presence within 100 yards of her is a violation." He looked at Reyes again. "You can call it in and confirm. I'll wait." Reyes reached for his radio. Whitaker took a step toward the gate. "Serafina." His voice changed when it was directed at her. All the boardroom smoothness dropped away, and something more practiced moved in underneath it. The intimate register that was meant to reach past her defenses and touch something that still recognized him. "I know you're scared. I know he's told you things. Don't." Her voice came out quieter than Damien expected. Not afraid, just stripped down to something absolute. "Don't use that voice. I just want to know you're okay. I'm going to need you to look at me and actually hear what I'm saying." She took one step forward, closer to the gate, and Damien stayed exactly where he was and let her. "I am not scared. I am not being held here. I did not send Thomas a message because I don't talk to Thomas, and I haven't for 3 weeks." She looked at her uncle, direct, and something in her voice hardened into something that had been soft for a long time. "Whatever he told you," I said, "he invented it." Thomas Hale's face did the complicated thing again. "Serafina, I'm worried about you. This man—" "You introduced me to Grant," she said. "You told me he was a good man, and when I called you from the hospital with a fractured arm, and I told you what actually happened, you told me to go home and be a better wife." She let that sit in the cold morning air. "You don't get to be worried about me now." Thomas opened his mouth. "We're done talking to you," Damien said. Whitaker's mask slipped another degree. "She's clearly been coached. She's clearly speaking." Damien looked at him with the particular steadiness that had ended harder conversations than this one. "That's what she's doing. She's speaking. Try to hear it." Reyes was still on his radio. Damien watched him listen to whatever dispatch was telling him, watched his posture change as the information landed. When he lowered the radio, his face had made a decision. "Sir," he said to Whitaker, "there is an active order. I can't—" "This is private family business," Whitaker said, his voice sharpening. "She needs to confirm to me directly, not through him." "She just did," Reyes said, quietly, firmly. The voice of a man who had recalibrated and landed on the side of what was directly in front of him. "She stated clearly that she is here voluntarily and does not want contact." He looked at Whitaker with the expression of someone who had begun to understand what kind of situation this actually was. "I'm going to need you to step back from the gate." Everything happened in the space between 1 second and the next. Whitaker's composure didn't crack. It detonated. The performance fell away all at once, the way a structure goes when the foundational load shifts past the tolerance point. His face went from sculpted to raw, and what was underneath wasn't grief or love or any of the things he'd been performing. It was fury, pure and unmanaged, the rage of a man who had never once in his life been told no by someone who then remained standing. He moved toward the gate, not rushing, something worse than rushing. The deliberate forward momentum of a man who had decided that consequences were no longer a relevant factor. Marcus moved at the same time. One of his people stepped forward, the gate held between them. "Open the gate." Whitaker's voice had dropped to something guttural, looking past everyone else at Serafina. "You're coming with me. That's the end of it. Back up." Damien stepped in front of the gate, directly in Whitaker's sightline. "Right now." "You don't back up." Whitaker's hand came up and hit the iron bars of the gate. The sound rang out across the drive. Serafina flinched, full body, involuntary, the deep-wired response that lived below conscious control. And then something happened that Damien would not forget. She caught the flinch. He watched her catch it mid-motion, watched her straighten from it deliberately, watched her breathe through it, and stand up taller on the other side of it. She looked at Whitaker through the gate with steady eyes. "I'm not coming with you," she said. "I'm not coming back. I'm not changing my mind. There's nothing you can do or say that changes any of that." Whitaker stared at her. Something shifted in his face. The fury finding a new shape, folding into something uglier and more calculated. His eyes moved to Damien. "Your Baltimore problem is going to land on the front page of every major outlet by tomorrow morning," he said. Quiet now. Precise. "I've already made the calls. The documentation is already in the right hands. By tomorrow night, everything you've built—" The sound of a second car coming up the estate road cut him off. Everyone turned. A black sedan moving fast. Not Damien's people, wrong vehicle profile coming from the coastal approach road rather than the main highway. It pulled up behind the police unit and stopped hard, gravel scattering. 2 men got out. Damien recognized the one on the left. Federal agent named Carver, out of the Boston field office. They had a complicated history that had never become openly hostile, but had always existed on the edge of it. Carver was in his 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with the face of a man who had spent too many years cataloging what people were capable of. He walked straight past Whitaker, past the police unit, directly to the gate. "Mr. Voss!" He held up his credentials. We need to talk." Damien didn't move. "About." "Grant Whitaker came to our office this morning at 5 a.m. with documentation pertaining to your organization's Baltimore operations." Carver's voice was professionally neutral, which meant nothing except that he was professional. "Before we proceed with any action based on that documentation, I need to hear your account of some specific transactions." Whitaker made a sound, almost a laugh, the sound of a man who thought he had just watched his plan arrive. "Specifically," Carver continued, turning slightly toward Whitaker now, "I'd like to understand why the documentation Mr. Whitaker provided contains financial signatures that trace back to accounts registered to Whitaker Capital's subsidiaries." He looked at Whitaker with an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. "I'm also going to need you to explain why you're currently in violation of a restraining order, because the officer behind you looks like he's about to do something about that, and I'd like to have a conversation first." The silence that followed was total. Whitaker's face had gone the color of old paper. "That's not—" He stopped. "The accounts are—" "Sir?" Carver pointed at the SUV. "Step away from the gate and wait by your vehicle, right now." The 2 men Whitaker had brought stepped forward. Carver's partner came around the sedan immediately, hand moving to the left side of his jacket. Marcus's people repositioned at the gate. Whitaker looked at the accumulated opposition in front of him. Federal agents, estate security, a local officer who had stopped being his asset approximately 8 minutes ago. And his body did something Damien had watched men's bodies do before when a plan collapsed completely. It lost the posture that performance required. His shoulders dropped. His chin came down. He looked suddenly like exactly what he was, a frightened, cornered man who had spent decades doing damage from positions of safety and was now standing in a field with no cover. He stepped back. "Smart," Carver said. He looked at Damien. "I'm going to need 20 minutes. "Come through," Damien said. Marcus opened the gate. They used the study. Carver's partner stayed outside. Thomas Hale stood at the window of the driveway with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular, and the officer watched him with the air of a man who had entirely recalibrated his understanding of the morning he'd walked into. Serafina went to the kitchen. Damien saw her go and didn't call her back. She needed space to breathe and process, and what happened in the study was his territory. Carver sat across from him and put a tablet on the desk with documents on the screen. "Whitaker came in this morning presenting this as evidence of money laundering through your Baltimore shipping operation," Carver said. What he apparently didn't know, or didn't check carefully enough, was that the account trail he was using to implicate you also runs directly through 3 Whitaker Capital shell subsidiaries. His own people constructed the documentation. Badly. He looked at Damien. Either someone set him up with dirty evidence or he built the case himself without understanding what he was building. But he's been desperate and moving fast, Damien said. Desperation makes people sloppy. It does. Carver looked at the tablet. The Baltimore operation itself. I'm not going to tell you I have no interest in it, because that would be dishonest. But what Whitaker brought us doesn't give us anything actionable against you. What it does give us is a fairly solid look at some of his own financial practices that we've had questions about for 3 years. He looked up. I'm going to need your cooperation in building that case. Damien looked at him. Passive cooperation, Carver said. I'm not asking you to testify. I'm asking you not to interfere with where this goes. Damien thought about it for 4 seconds. What does that get her? Carver didn't pretend not to understand who he meant. The restraining order violations alone are enough to remand him pending a hearing. His finances being under active federal investigation makes bail a different conversation. He won't be a free man in the near term. He paused. And I'll need a statement from her about the circumstances of this morning. The restraining order violation, Thomas Hale's involvement. That builds a stronger case for extended remand. You'll get it, Damien said, through my attorney. Carver nodded, stood, picked up the tablet. At the door he stopped. She all right? Damien looked at him. I've seen the file, Carver said simply. The original police report and what happened to it. I've seen files like that before. He didn't elaborate. Just looked at Damien with the expression of a man who had decided to say the thing rather than leave it. It's good that she has someone. He left. Damien sat alone in the study for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen. She was standing on the counter with a mug she wasn't drinking from, looking at the courtyard. The roses were there in the morning light, steady and unhurried, doing what they did. She heard him come in. Is it over? She asked. The immediate part. He came to stand beside her at the window. Whitaker is going to be remanded pending a hearing. The federal involvement complicates things for him significantly. She nodded slowly. Thomas? She asked. He's going to be questioned. What happens after that depends on what he cooperates with. He paused. I'm sorry. I know he was... Don't. Her voice was quiet but firm. Don't apologize for him. He made his choices a long time ago. She looked at the roses. I just didn't know they included me. He stood beside her and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say to that, and she didn't need him to try. After a moment, she said, I caught it. He looked at her. When Grant hit the gate and I flinched, she was still looking at the courtyard. I caught it. I felt it coming up and I caught it, and I stood back up. A pause. I've never done that before. I've always just gone into it. The flinch, and then everything after the flinch. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry and very clear. I stood back up. I know, he said. I saw. She looked at him for a moment. Really looked. The same way she had that first morning at the table, but different now. Less measuring, more direct. Like something that had been suspended in assessment had finally landed somewhere. I told him he didn't own me, she said, through the gate. I didn't plan it. It just came out. I heard that too. Did it sound... She stopped. It sounded true, he said. She turned back to the window, breathed in, breathed out. Then quietly, what happens now? Now we wait for the legal process to move, he said. My attorney handles the federal communication. You give a statement on the restraining order violation. Whitaker sits in a room and finally starts to understand what accountability feels like. She nodded, drank her coffee, made a face because it had gone cold. He took the mug from her hand, poured it out, and refilled it without being asked. She watched him do it. Something in her face had shifted. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in performances of emotion. Just the subtle, cellular movement of a person coming back to themselves after a very long absence. She took the mug back. Their hands overlapped on it for a moment before she took it. His fingers and hers on the same ceramic for 2 seconds before she drew it toward herself. Neither of them said anything about it. His phone buzzed. Marcus. He stepped back and answered. They're taking Whitaker into custody, Marcus said. Reyes is handling the restraining order violation. Federal team is flagging him for the financial investigation. He's being walked to the federal vehicle right now. A brief pause. He's not going quietly. He never does, Damien said. There's something else. Marcus's voice shifted into the register it used for information that required careful handling. One of Whitaker's people, the security he brought in the SUV, we ran him while everything was happening at the gate. He's not private security. He's a former associate of the Deller organization. Callahan's people. Damien went still. The Callahan situation. The shipping contract gone sideways in Baltimore. The lieutenant sending contradictory reports. The customs official who'd stopped returning calls. He had set it aside when Serafina's nightmare pulled him in a different direction. He had let it sit for weeks. How long has he been with Whitaker? He said. We don't know yet. Could be recent. Could be that Whitaker's leverage on my Baltimore operation wasn't built from public information, Damien said. The shape of it arriving fully assembled, the way the worst revelations always did. Not gradually, but all at once. Could be that someone from Callahan's side gave it to him. That's the read, Marcus said, which means Whitaker wasn't the original play. He was the delivery mechanism. Damien turned slightly away from Serafina, lowering his voice without leaving the room. Where's Callahan? That's what I'm pulling now. A pause. Damien, if Callahan used Whitaker to move against your Baltimore operation while your attention was here, then this morning wasn't the endgame, Damien said. It was the distraction. The line was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, Damien could see the federal vehicle beginning to move down the estate road. Whitaker in the back of it, head down, the charming public man finally absent, leaving only whatever was underneath. Get me Callahan's location, Damien said. And Marcus, I need to know right now whether Baltimore is still standing. Working on it. A pause. I'll call you back in 10. He lowered the phone, turned back to Serafina. She was watching him with the steady, alert expression she wore when she was reading a situation. And she was reading this one accurately. He could tell by the way she'd gone still. Something else, she said. Not a question. Possibly. He looked at her. Stay inside today. Don't go to the courtyard. Don't open the doors. Marcus's team stays at full position. He held her gaze. Can you do that? Yes. Immediate. No argument. She understood the difference between being managed and being asked to do something operationally necessary, and she didn't confuse them. What is it? I don't know the full shape yet. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he'd left it hours ago. I'll know in 10 minutes. His phone rang. Not Marcus. A number he recognized from Baltimore. His operations manager there, a woman named Petra, who had been running the shipping side of things for 4 years, and who had a policy of never calling unless the situation was... He answered before the second ring. Talk, he said. Petra's voice was controlled but stripped of its usual efficiency, the way a voice got when the speaker was relaying information that they had not yet fully absorbed themselves. The warehouse on Harbor Row, she said. The main intake facility. Someone walked in at 6 this morning with documentation claiming federal seizure authority. Our people let them through because the paperwork looked right. By the time we verified it was forged, they had accessed the secondary records room, and what did they take? Damien's voice had gone very flat. The physical ledgers. A pause. The ones from the last 18 months. And Damien, her voice caught for just a fraction of a second. They took Martin's. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Martin's was not a thing. Martin's was a person. His operations coordinator in Baltimore, 30 years old, who had been with his organization since he was 19, and who was one of approximately 4 people in the world who knew the full structure of the Baltimore operation from the inside. When? He said. We confirmed 30 minutes ago. We thought he'd stepped out. The security footage shows him leaving with them voluntarily, but Petra stopped. He didn't look voluntary. The kitchen was very quiet. Serafina was watching him from across the room. She couldn't hear Petra's voice, but she could hear the quality of his silence, and she knew something had changed in the weight of the room. This wasn't Whitaker anymore. Whitaker had been the surface, the angry, desperate former husband with his planted evidence and his desperate gambit. The gate, the police unit, the federal agent, all of it had been exactly what it looked like on the surface, a man thrashing against his own consequences. But underneath the surface, Callahan had been moving. While Damien's attention had been on the gate, on Serafina, on the immediate invisible threat that he could put his body between, Callahan had walked through the back door of his Baltimore operation and taken the one person who Callahan had walked through the back door of his Baltimore operation and taken the one person who knew where all the bones were buried. Damien lowered the phone. He stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the sound of the federal vehicle finishing its trip down the estate road and the roses sitting in the courtyard doing nothing but existing. And he let himself have exactly 5 seconds of the thing underneath the operational thinking. The cold, nauseating recognition that he had been outmaneuvered, that someone had read his attention correctly and used it against him, that Martins was somewhere right now in a situation that was Damien's fault by way of distraction. 5 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called Petra back. "Lock down everything that's left," he said. "Physical and digital. Nobody moves product, nobody opens a door, nobody takes a meeting until I say otherwise. And get me the names of every person who had contact with Martins in the last 2 weeks. Staff, contractors, anybody." "Already compiling." "The forged documentation? Who processed it on our end?" "Delgado. He's been with us 4 years. I'm not saying he's involved. I'm saying I need to talk to him. Get him on a secure line in the next 30 minutes. He was already moving through the kitchen toward the hallway, pulling his jacket on. "And Petra, if Callahan makes contact, any contact, you record it and you call me before you respond. Not after. Before." "Understood." He ended the call. Serafina was standing exactly where he'd left her, mug in both hands, watching him with the focused stillness of a woman who had learned to read emergencies through the behavior of the people around her, because that was often the only early warning she got. "Baltimore," she said. "Yes." "Is someone hurt?" He looked at her. "Not yet." She held his gaze. "What do you need?" The question landed differently than he expected. Not what's happening or how bad is it, or the instinctive self-protective, what does this mean for me? Just the clean, forward-facing question of someone who had decided which side of the situation they were standing on. "I need to go to Baltimore," he said. "Today. I need Marcus here with you. Full team. Nobody comes through that gate. Nobody gets near this house." "Go," she said. "I'll be back." "Go," she said again. "I'll be here." He looked at her for one more second. Then he went. The drive to the airfield took 22 minutes. Marcus fell in beside him for the first 10 of them, receiving the full operational briefing in the precise sequential way that Marcus received all information, absorbing without interrupting, filing without reacting. When Damien finished, Marcus said, "Callahan's play is clean." "Yes?" "He knew you'd be distracted by Whitaker. He built the distraction." Damien watched the highway move under them. "Or he identified it and used it. Either way it worked." He paused. "The Whitaker connection to Callahan's people, I want to know how deep that goes. Whether Callahan approached Whitaker or Whitaker found Callahan, and when. I'll have it by the time you land." "And Martins." He stopped, started again. "Find him, Marcus. Whatever it takes to locate him, do it." Marcus said nothing for a moment, then, "Callahan won't hurt him if Martins is useful, and Martins is only useful alive." "I know." He also knew that useful was a temporary condition. "Find him fast." That Baltimore in November was gray and salt-bitten, the harbor churning under a low sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or simply threaten it indefinitely. Damien went to the Harbor Row facility first, not because there was anything left to see that Petra hadn't already documented, but because he needed to stand in the room where it had happened and look at it with his own eyes. The secondary records room was a 10 by 12 space off the main warehouse floor, shelved on 3 walls, with a desk in the center that still had Martin's coffee cup on it. Half empty, rim-stained, the specific mundane detail that made the absence concrete in a way that operational reports couldn't. He stood in the doorway and looked at the empty shelves for 45 seconds. Then he went to find Delgado. Delgado was 37, compact, with the face of a man who hadn't slept and knew it showed. He was in Petra's office when Damien arrived, sitting very still in the way that people sat when they were waiting for judgment and had decided that stillness was their best available posture. Damien sat across from him. "Tell me exactly what the documentation looked like," he said. Delgado told him. Federal seizure order, correctly formatted, bearing a case number that had since been confirmed as fabricated but which had matched an active case number format correctly enough that a 4-year veteran of Damien's operation had not caught the discrepancy on first review. The two men who'd presented it had been professional, unhurried, wearing the particular ease of people accustomed to being admitted to places. "Did you recognize either of them?" Damien asked. "No, but—" Delgado stopped, reconsidered. "The taller one. He had a Baltimore accent, not put on, real. Local." "I think so." Damien thought about that. Callahan had used local people, which meant he had infrastructure in Baltimore that Damien had underestimated, which meant the problem was not a single operation, but a parallel structure that had been building quietly while Damien's attention was distributed elsewhere. He spent 2 hours at the facility. When he left, he had a cleaner picture of the damage and a specific name that Marcus had texted him while he was with Delgado, a mid-level Callahan lieutenant named Roy Sessa, who had been active in the Baltimore waterfront for 8 months under a legitimate logistics company cover. Roy Sessa was currently having lunch at a diner 4 blocks from the harbor. Damien drove there himself. Sessa was 44, heavy-set, with the uncomplicated face of a man who had spent his career doing what he was told by people smarter than himself. He was on his second cup of coffee when Damien sat down across from him, and he looked up with the expression of someone who recognized a situation arriving and had not prepared adequately for it. "Mr. Sessa," Damien said. Sessa said nothing. His hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," Damien said. "Quiet. Absolute. There are 2 of my people in this diner and 1 outside the door. Whatever you're reaching for, leave it where it is." Sessa's hand stopped. "Where is Martins?" Damien said. "I don't know who—" "You know exactly who. The man your people walked out of my facility this morning." He leaned forward slightly. "I want to be very clear about your options. You can tell me where he is and what Callahan wants for him, and this conversation ends here, and you walk out of this diner on your own feet, or you decline to tell me, and a different kind of conversation happens somewhere less public." He held Sessa's eyes. "I genuinely prefer the first one. I've had a long day." Sessa looked at the table, looked at his coffee. Did the calculation that men in his position did when they understood the actual shape of what they were in. "Fell's Point," he said. "Callahan's storage facility on the East Pier. He's not hurt." A pause. "He was supposed to be a message." "What message?" "That the Baltimore operation runs through Callahan now. That you can walk away clean if you formalize it. 20% of the operation in exchange for Martins and the ledgers and no further action." Sessa looked up. "That's the offer. I'm just telling you what I know." Damien sat with that for a moment. "Call him," he said. "Right now. Tell him I'm coming to the East Pier, and I want to talk." Sessa blinked. "You want me to—" "Tell him I'm coming to negotiate." He held Sessa's gaze. "Can you do that?" Sessa pulled out his phone with a hand that wasn't entirely steady and made the call. The East Pier facility was a converted cold storage building, the kind that accumulated on working harbors the way sediment accumulated on riverbeds, slowly, without design, until it was simply part of the landscape. The interior smelled like brine and old refrigerant. The overhead lights were industrial and unflattering, and they caught the faces of the 6 men standing in the main floor space with the kind of clarity that left nothing to interpretation. Callahan was not a large man. This was the first thing Damien registered when he walked in. He had been building a mental image of a physical threat, and the reality was a compact 58-year-old with a gray beard and the patient eyes of someone who did not feel the need to perform danger because the people around him performed it on his behalf. He was sitting on a folding chair in the center of the space like it was a boardroom. Martins was against the far wall, wrist zip-tied in front of him, a cut above his left eyebrow that had dried but not been treated. He was alert, scared, but holding it. When he saw Damien walk in, something in his face went through relief and tried to convert it into composure before it got there. Damien looked at him once, just long enough to communicate that he had registered him and that it was going to be all right, and then looked at Callahan. "You've gone to a lot of trouble," Damien said. "You've been distracted," Callahan said. "Trouble finds you when you're distracted." The offer Sessa relayed. Damien stopped in the center of the floor, equidistant from Callahan and the door. 20%. The ledgers. Martins. And no further disruption to your remaining operations. Callahan spread his hands, a reasonable man making a reasonable proposal. "I don't want a war. Wars are expensive and unpredictable. I want a business arrangement. And the approach you chose to propose this arrangement was taking one of my people and forging federal documentation. I needed your attention, Callahan said simply. You've been hard to reach. I've been home. You've been somewhere else entirely. Something in Callahan's eyes shifted. Not malice, something more dispassionate than malice. The assessment of a tactician, noting a vulnerability. A woman will do that. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Counter. Callahan tilted his head. Counter proposal, Damien said. You return Martins and the ledgers. You pull your people out of Baltimore and cease all operations on the waterfront within my territory. In exchange, I don't pursue what you've built here. I don't escalate to the organizations above you that would be interested to know you've been running a parallel structure without authorization, and you and I have no further interaction. He paused. That's the offer. Callahan looked at him, the patient eyes doing their work. You're not in a position to make that offer. You have 6 people in this room, Damien said. I came in with 2. But Marcus Webb is outside this building right now, with 11 more, and the 2 I came in with have already neutralized the 2 you posted at the back of the facility, which is why your phone hasn't rung in the last 4 minutes, even though you've been expecting a check-in. He held Callahan's gaze. You're in a position to make a decision. I'd recommend making it quickly. Callahan's eyes moved to the door at the back of the facility, then to the 2 men nearest him, then back to Damien. The calculation happened visibly, the way calculations happen in men who were intelligent enough to read a situation accurately when they finally had complete information. He nodded once. Cut him loose, he said to the man nearest Martins. The drive back to the airfield was quiet. Martins sat in the back seat with a field dressing on the cut above his eye, not talking, which was what people did after the adrenaline dropped. They went interior, sorting through what had happened and what it had cost them. Damien let him be quiet. Halfway to the airfield, Martin said, I didn't give them anything. I know, Damien said. They wanted the secondary account structures. I told them the ledgers were all there was. A pause. I don't know if they believed me. It doesn't matter now. Another stretch of silence. I'm sorry, Martin said. I should have flagged the Callahan movement months ago. I saw things that didn't track and I attributed them to... So did I, Damien said. We both missed it. Martin said nothing after that. The plane lifted out of Baltimore into gray sky and turned south toward the coast, and Damien sat in the forward cabin and looked out at the cloud cover and let himself feel the full weight of the day. Not the operational weight, which he knew how to carry, but the other kind. The weight of understanding how thoroughly he had allowed his attention to be drawn in a direction and how much that had nearly cost. He thought about Serafina saying go and meaning it. He thought about her standing at the gate saying, you don't own me anymore. He thought about the roses in the courtyard, planted with patient, careful hands in ground that had been empty before she arrived. He took out his phone and called her. She answered on the 3rd ring. It's done, he said. I'm on my way back. A brief silence. Martins? Safe. With me. He heard her exhale. Not dramatically, just the long, quiet release of a breath that had been held. The roses need water, she said. It was such an ordinary sentence after such an extraordinary day that he found himself almost smiling, which was not something he did frequently or easily. I'll water them when I get back, he said. You don't know how. You can show me. Another silence. Different quality. Softer and more uncertain, the way silences got when both people in them were feeling something they hadn't entirely processed yet. Okay, she said. Same word she always used, but it kept meaning more each time. He landed 2 hours later. The estate was quiet when he came through the gate. Marcus met him in the driveway and gave him the short version. Whitaker in federal custody. Remand hearing scheduled for the following week. Thomas Hale being interviewed by Carver's team and cooperating with the enthusiasm of a man trying to minimize his own exposure. The local officer, Reyes, had filed a clean report that corroborated everything Serafina had said at the gate. The staff member who had fed information to Whitaker's PI had been formally let go and had signed the appropriate documentation. The pieces of it, assembled, constituted the end of Grant Whitaker as a threat. Not the end of him as a person, not the end of his ability to exist in the world, but the end of his ability to reach her. The restraining order, the federal investigation into his financials, the documented violation at the gate, and the statement Serafina would give through Damien's attorney would collectively build a cage around the man that his money and his performance and his cultivated networks could not unlock. It would take time. It would require patience and legal precision and the sustained application of resources that Damien had and Whitaker was running out of. But it was done in the way that mattered most tonight. He was not here, and she was safe, and the ground between those two facts was solid enough to stand on. Marcus finished the briefing and then said, in the same tone he used for operational information, "She's in the courtyard." Damien went to find her. She was sitting on the low stone bench beside the planters, not working, just sitting. She had her hands wrapped around a mug of something hot, and she was looking at the roses in the evening light, which came in low and golden through the gap in the east wall at this hour, hitting the new stems at an angle that made them look more established than they were. She heard him come in and looked up. He sat beside her on the bench. Not close, just beside. They sat in silence for a while, the estate quiet around them, the sound of the ocean below the bluff steady and indifferent and somehow exactly right. "How is he?" she asked. She meant Martin's. "Shaken. He'll be all right." She nodded, looked at her mug. "Thomas called," she said, "while you were gone." He looked at her. "What did he say?" "He wanted to explain." She said it without inflection. He'd prepared something. He said he thought he was helping me, that Grant was stable and successful, and that I was... She stopped. "He said he thought I needed someone to take care of me, that I was the kind of person who needed that." She looked at the roses. "He believed it, I think. That's the worst part. He genuinely believes that what he did was a form of care." "What did you say?" "I told him I'd spent my entire adult life surrounded by men who thought they knew better than I did what I needed." She paused. "And that I was done with all of them." She said it quietly, without heat, the kind of thing that was only said quietly because it was entirely and completely true, and truth at that level of specificity didn't need volume. "All of them?" he said. She looked at him. The question hung in the space between them, and it was a real question, and she knew it was, and she didn't look away from it. "Most of them," she said. He held her gaze. "I don't know what this is," she said. "What we are. I don't have a clean category for it, and I've stopped trying to make one." She looked back at the roses. "I know that I sleep through the night here. I know that when things went wrong this morning, my first instinct was not to disappear. I know that when you said come to the gate with me, I was scared and I went anyway because I trusted you to be standing there." She paused. "Those are things I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that I drove home from Baltimore thinking about roses," he said. She looked at him. "I've been running operations in 4 cities for 16 years, he said. "I have never once driven home from anything thinking about plants." He looked at her steadily. "That's new." She was very still. "I don't know what this is either," he said. "But I stopped trying to categorize it about 3 weeks ago, and I'm not going back to trying." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the light shifted slightly, the gold going incrementally warmer as the sun moved. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. Not dramatically. Just placed it there, quietly, the way you place something down when you'd been carrying it long enough and had finally found somewhere trustworthy to set it. He didn't move. He didn't put his arm around her or make any movement that would announce the significance of the moment. He just sat there and let her head rest on his shoulder and looked at the roses she had planted in the ground of this house that had been empty before she came. They sat there until the light was gone. The weeks that followed were not simple. Simple would have required Damien's operations to stop requiring his attention, which they didn't. The Callahan situation required careful unwinding, not confrontation, not further escalation, but the slow, methodical withdrawal of the man's Baltimore foothold through the patient application of pressure at the points where his structure was weakest. It took 6 weeks and 3 intermediary conversations, and the rerouting of 2 contracts that Callahan had quietly annexed. At the end of it, Roy Sessa was working for a legitimate logistics company in a diminished capacity, and Callahan had been quietly made to understand that Baltimore was not a frontier he could afford to continue exploring. Martins came back to work 3 weeks after Harbor Row. He came back thinner and more careful, which was what certain kinds of experience did to people who had the sense to learn from them. He never discussed what had happened in the facility on the East Pier except once, briefly, when he told Damien that the worst part hadn't been the fear. The worst part had been not knowing whether anyone was coming. Damien heard this and did not respond to it directly. He filed it in the part of himself that held things that required sitting with rather than resolving, and he carried it forward. Whitaker's remand hearing produced the result Carver's team had built toward: extended remand pending the financial investigation. The restraining order violation added to a mounting record that his attorney was finding increasingly difficult to manage. The federal case into Whitaker Capital's shell structures moved slowly, as federal cases did, but it moved forward. Grant Whitaker's particular hold on the world, the network of small corruptions and performed respectability that had protected him for years, had begun to come apart in the specific way that these things came apart when a federal agency with sufficient institutional will decided to keep pulling on a thread. Thomas Hale cooperated fully with Carver's investigation in exchange for reduced exposure. He attempted to contact Serafina twice more. She did not respond to either attempt. She did not explain this decision to anyone. She did not perform it. She simply chose it and moved forward, which was, Damien had come to understand, how she made most of her real decisions. Quietly, completely, without the need for an audience. The garden in the East Courtyard expanded through December and into the early months of the following year. She enrolled in the teaching program she'd abandoned when the marriage to Grant had made it impractical. An online certification initially, then in-person seminars twice a week, which required her to be off the property for 4 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The first Tuesday she left for the seminar, Damien watched the gate camera until the car cleared the property and then spent 40 minutes trying to read a report that he read 4 times without retaining. She came home at 6:15. She walked through the kitchen, describing the seminar instructor's teaching philosophy with the animated, slightly exasperated energy of someone who was engaged and stimulated and had opinions, and Damien sat at the table and listened to every word of it and said almost nothing and felt something settle in his chest that had been displaced for a very long time. When she paused and looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes and said, "You look like you've been waiting up," he said. "I was working, and she said you have the same report in your hand that you had when I left." And he said nothing, and she almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The expression he had learned over months to recognize as the closest she came to it when something was genuinely landing, and went to make tea. The night he asked her to marry him for real was in the courtyard. It was spring, and the roses had done what roses do when they are properly tended. They had grown past the tentativeness of their first weeks in new ground and become themselves, fully and without apology. The courtyard smelled like them in the evenings when the temperature dropped and the moisture came up from the ocean. He had not planned it. He had been out there because she was out there, and they had been sitting on the stone bench for 20 minutes in the comfortable silence that had become the specific texture of their evenings together. And he had been looking at the roses and thinking about nothing in particular, and then thinking about something in particular, and then he said it. "I want to do this again," he said, "the right way." She looked at him. Not an arrangement. He looked at her. Not a strategic alignment. Not any of the language that was used when we started. He paused. Just us. A real marriage, if that's something you want. She was quiet for a long moment. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of a person taking something in fully before they responded to it, respecting it enough not to answer before they were sure. "I want to want things," she said finally. "That's the thing I've been learning, that I'm allowed to want things for myself, not because they're safe or practical or because someone has decided they're appropriate." She looked at him. "And I want this." He nodded. "No ceremony," she said. "Something small. Whatever you want." "I want the courtyard." She looked at the roses. "In the evening, when it smells like this." "Then that's what we'll do." She looked back at him, and in the evening light, in the space she had tended from emptiness into something alive, her face had the particular quality of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were traveling toward, and recognized it anyway. The ceremony was 12 people. Marcus stood near the back with the expression of a man who was feeling more than he intended to display, which for Marcus was legible only to people who had known him long enough to read the baseline. Elaine, The housekeeper, who had become something family-shaped without any formal declaration, stood near the front and did not bother to conceal anything at all. The roses were in their fullest period. The evening light did exactly what it always did at this hour, came through the gap in the east wall in gold, hitting the petals at an angle that made everything in the courtyard look like it had been considered carefully. She walked toward him through the small gathered people with no performance in her movement, no ceremony in her face, just herself, walking toward a person she had chosen with full information and clear eyes, in a place she had made habitable with her own hands. He watched her come and thought about the night she had whispered, "Please don't hit me," in her sleep, and he had felt something crack open in his chest. He thought about how far that night was from this one. He thought about all the ground between them, the ugly ground, the hard ground, the ground that required both of them to move differently than they had before. He thought about how none of it had been simple, and how simple had never been the point. She stopped in front of him. Her eyes were dry and direct, which was exactly how she looked when she meant something completely. "You don't have to say anything beautiful," she said quietly, low enough for just him. "I know you're not good at that." "I know some things," he said. "Tell me one." He looked at her. At the person who had been broken to pieces by people who should have protected her, and who had assembled herself back into something that didn't need protecting anymore, who had chosen, from a position of wholeness rather than desperation, to be here. "You were already whole when you got here," he said. "I just didn't know that yet. You didn't either." He paused. "The rest of it, all of it, we figured out from there." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, not with the weight of ceremony, just took his hand the way you took the hand of someone you trusted, with the specific, ordinary trust of a person who understood what trust had cost them and gave it anyway. The light held. The roses held. And in the courtyard she had planted from nothing into something alive, they made the promises that mattered. Not the polished ones, not the rehearsed ones, but the true ones. The ones that acknowledged the difficulty of what they were promising and promised it anyway, with full knowledge of what promises cost when people finally meant them. Months later. The bedroom was dark except for the moonlight that came through the gap in the curtains, falling across the floor in a long, pale rectangle that shifted slightly as the night moved. Serafina slept. Damien lay beside her in the dark and listened to her breathe, slow, even, untroubled. The deep, undefended sleep of someone who no longer needed to be ready for what the night might bring. No trembling, no whispered pleading, no hands gripping the pillow against something that only existed in the darkest part of memory. Just sleep, just breathing, just the specific, hard-won piece of a person who had survived everything that had tried to reduce her and had emerged from it, slowly and without ceremony, into herself. He had spent his life in rooms where the air was made of threat. He had spent 41 years building structures designed to hold against whatever came at them, stacking resources and leverage and the calculated management of fear until the whole edifice was so dense nothing could move through it. He had not understood until now what it felt like to protect something that was worth all of it. He looked at her sleeping face in the moonlight, the quiet lines of it, the complete absence of bracing. He had conquered harder things than what he had conquered in this house. He had moved through more complex terrain at higher stakes with fewer resources. But looking at her now, the woman who had walked toward him through the roses with dry eyes and her own name, he understood that this was the one that mattered, not because it had been the most dangerous, because it had required him to become someone capable of deserving it. He looked at the moonlight on the floor. He listened to her breathe. Outside, the Atlantic moved against the bluff in its old, indifferent rhythm. The same water, the same dark, the same coast. Only what stood above it had changed. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, he slept.